Well, good morning, everyone. Please allow me to introduce myself. I'm Karen Butler. I'm also known as Kate. It's confusing sometimes. Assistant curator at the Kemper Art Museum here at Washington University. It is my pleasure to welcome you here this morning and to introduce today's distinguished guests. The artist John Stezaker on my right, and the art historian and art critic Michael Newman, who is on John's right. I'm very pleased to have both of them here for a conversation about John's work, which is on view next door in the Kemper Art Museum. Since the late 1970s, John has mined the vast culture of images that developed in the first half of the 20th century to create deceptively simple collages. Using postcards, film stills, studio portraits, encyclopedias, magazines, and novellas, he creates artworks by cropping, slicing, realigning, or combining seemingly incompatible images. The resulting works produce unexpected connections, both compelling and disrupting, as you will see today. Placed in a new context, these transformed images recall their origins in the world of mass culture, but also encourage the viewer to stop and look with renewed fascination at the image itself. John was recently shortlisted for the art world's most prestigious photography prize. I have to brag in John's honor. It's the Deutsche Börse Photography Prize. The prize is awarded to a contemporary photographer of any nationality who has made the most significant contribution through either a publication or an exhibition to the medium of photography in Europe in the previous year. And in fact, it was the version of this exhibition that was at the Whitechapel Gallery in London this spring and summer of 2011, which garnered John the nomination. So we're thrilled to have John here. We're thrilled to have the exhibition here. And I'm not sure when we will find out the results of that prize, possibly a few months. Michael Newman is professor of art writing at Goldsmiths College and also teaches art history at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He has written extensively on contemporary art, including the critically acclaimed books Richard Prince, Untitled, Couple, and Jeff Wall. The first was published in 2006, and Jeff Wall in 2007, and numerous essays on artists, including Alfred Jensen, Hannah Darboven, Joel Terlinks, Dara Birnbaum, Seth Price, Hilary Lloyd, and of course, John Stezaker. He co-edited Rewriting Conceptual Art, published in 1999, and also writes on European philosophy. Curatorial projects include The Mirror and the Lamp at Fruit Market, which is in Scotland, and the ICA in London, which he co-curated with Mark Francis in 1986, and Tacita Dean at the Art Gallery of York University in Toronto in 2000, on whom he has also published 3 essays. And Michael is also currently writing a monograph, which will be a comprehensive study of John's work, so we're anxiously awaiting that. No, I'm excitedly awaiting it. Michael and John have known each other since they taught together at Central St. Martin's School of Art in the 1980s, and both of them have flown in from London this week for the exhibition and today's discussion. I am thrilled to have them here today. The format for this morning's discussion is as follows. Michael and John will speak, we'll have a conversation for about 45 minutes. I'm going to join them and jump in from time to time. And we welcome questions from the audience at the end. I will also mention that these lectures are available on YouTube, as are previous lectures. So if you're interested in seeing this again. Now I would like to ask you to join me in welcoming John Stezaker and Michael Newman. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Kate, for the introduction and for looking after us so well. To begin with, I want to recall when I first met John, which, if I remember rightly, was 1980. when he was teaching at St. Martin's School of Art, and I ended up also teaching at St. Martin's School of Art subsequently to that, so we worked together. And I want to remember what struck me so strongly about his work then. He was using film publicity stills and some other material to make the collage that you've seen in the gallery. And really, what I felt about them was that they manifested an incredibly intense relationship to the image. And that's really what drew me to the work, first of all. And I felt there was a contrast there with quite a lot of other image-based work that I was seeing at the time. Image-based work that came out of conceptual art, as to an extent John's did, and that's something I'm going to want to ask about. The difference between John's work and quite a lot of other work is that other work seemed to be using text, whereas his work wasn't, and treating the image as something to be read, something to be decoded. So I felt that, to a certain extent, text was creating a kind of distance from the image and a control of the image, often in the name of a critical project. Now, John's work was so different to that because it seemed to have to do with the experience of being captivated by an image, being held by an image. And I found that really fascinating. And I'd like to begin by asking John about the move from conceptual art, because he was a conceptual artist who used text at one point and then moved into making images. So, and that also the difference, if you feel that too, between how you were treating images and how some other artists at the time coming out of conceptual art were treating images.
Yeah, Michael rightly, can you hear me, by the way? No? No.
I think just put this nearer.
Okay, all right. Yeah, my voice tends to be rather low, so if you can't hear, please signal, wave or something, yeah. Can you hear now? Oh, still can't hear. Should I go this close? How's that? Oh, right. Oh, my God. I can hear myself now. I hate hearing myself. Which is, in a way, what this is all about, really. I've never particularly liked my own mark or my own imprint. I rather like things that are already there in the world. But talking about that particular question of captioning is interesting, because I did have a sort of brief period as a conceptual artist working purely with text in the early 70s. But I became dissatisfied with conceptualism, and in fact I began to feel that it embodied really the main problems with... I can't hear me at all. Still can't hear me, yeah? Right here. Okay. I guess I'm going to have to bear the sound of my own voice. I can hear it echoing. You must be able to hear it now, yeah? Yeah. Can I get a signal from somebody? Can you hear me? Yeah. Jolly good. Okay. I'll try and keep at this volume. But I began to feel that the conceptualism was a cul-de-sac. There was nowhere to go with that. And also, I felt it was a sort of annihilation, really, of the image, which had been fundamental to my practice prior to that. So I was trying to find a way of reintroducing the image. And so for a while, I worked with image and caption. And there was quite a lot of this work, as Michael pointed out, in London at the time. The most famous being Victor Bergin, who was my tutor at one point and who I followed very much in the early days. But then I found the combination between, and I suppose the reason that we all thought at that time that image-text combinations were important was because that's the way the image appeared culturally. So if you were going to make a kind of, make a relationship with the dominant culture, one had to use the vernacular of that culture, and therefore I was interested in the way that advertising used images and text together. But the more I used it, the more dissatisfied I became with the results, because the caption appropriated only one meaning for the image. The ambiguity of the image was destroyed. And so I had to drop the text, but that left me in a sort of strange limbo. I thought, well, look, and this piece actually is quite interesting because it sat on sat in my flat for something like 5 years before I could decide that it was a piece. I thought, well, can that be it? Just recycling something that already exists? I mean, obviously it's been inverted, but... And I finally decided that that was really it. And in fact, it was a very welcome relief of my own sense of authorship. As I said earlier, I don't like the sound of my own voice. I didn't like the sound of didn't like the feel of anything that I put onto the work. Any kind of transition, textual enlargement, and everything seemed to be a mistake. I came back just to what was already there in the world. And this was I wasn't sure whether this was actually the end of my career as an artist or perhaps the beginning. And it turned out to be the beginning. So by meditating, taking an image like this, and meditating on a very simple, ordinary found image over a period of time, all kinds of incredible complexities began to emerge within it. The inversion of the producer and consumer of the image, the idea of the muse, all kinds of things started to occur to me around this image. This was actually this is a sort of foundational image in my practice. It's the first film still that I found and recycled in a way in this sense. Does that answer the question?
It partly answers the question. The other part of the question had to do with the intensity of a relation to the image, which I think is connected with allowing oneself to be fascinated by an image rather than trying to control it or be detached from it.
Absolutely. And I think fascination is essentially passive. I don't think you can be productively fascinated, so to speak. I think fascination has to be for something that already exists. And that's what I found. I could never do anything more interesting than what was already out there in the world, which does sound like a kind of aesthetic resignation on one hand, but equally, for me, it was the path towards an intense relationship with the image, and one in which the image became a kind of cipher, a means of self-interrogation in some way. It's very difficult to kind of describe it in any other way. In fact, I found it very difficult to put words for this. This is why I found it very difficult, this period, because I didn't have the vocabulary or the philosophical basis for thinking about what my practice had become. Was this a resignation, and yet this resignation was actually probably the most intense relationship I developed with the image. It was a few years later when I read the writings of the French philosopher Maurice Blanchot that I started to begin to realize that the fascination was really the key. And I believed really, and suddenly it all fell into place. I began to see the whole history of art as being the whole history of modern art, by which I mean from the Renaissance, as being a gradual reduction of an engagement with an image and more of an engagement with language and text. In Renaissance terms, you could say imago, image, was being destroyed by historia, which is, if you like, the textual or narrative relationship. So I felt what one needed to do is invert that, to regain that intensity of the image. One had to break with historia, narrative, linear reading. And Michael mentioned legibility. Most of the work that was being done at that time was very much about trying to make legible and to try and decode or deconstruct pre-existing images. I wasn't interested in that at all. I was interested in the mystery of what an image was itself. And Blanchot gave me the conceptual vocabulary to deal with this. He describes the image as essentially ambiguous. Another thing that he also talks about is the artist as essentially an exile from life in the world of images. I thought that's a wonderful idea because the whole imperative of modernity was to do with the artist relating to the culture that they lived in and appropriation in particular as being a kind of indexical reflection of the world around. And that was, to me, another imperative that seemed to be wrong. Why were artists forced to be dutiful in this sense and reflect on the culture around them, however negatively or in whatever way? I rather like the idea of Blanchet's idea of the image being a kind of alternative reality, an exile from the world. And increasingly, because of my practice of teaching, I found that, in fact, my work started to occupy more and more the space outside that world. So my work became an escape from the world of legibility and communications. So it was like trying to deal with the image as non-communicable in some way.
The audience here, I think, will be familiar with the American artists who were working around the same time as you were turning towards the image. I think shortly after you and I met, I went to New York and met Richard Prince, and some certain similarities struck me at that time when he was rephotographing images and also removing text and producing a kind of effect of the uncanny through the repetition of certain gestures which occurred in people looking in the same direction and so on in those images. And I'm thinking, obviously also of other artists of the time, Cindy Sherman, Robert Longo, Troy Brontock, maybe David Sally too, to a certain extent, artists also who were turning towards images. And I wondered whether you felt affinities and differences in relation to what they were doing and what those affinities and differences might be.
Yeah, very, very strongly. In particular, Richard. Richard and I became very good friends, and Richard Prince and I became very good friends when we met. The way we met was quite interesting, actually, because Sherry Levine wrote to me in London when she saw one of my earlier image text pieces from the time I'm describing, before I made this sort of revelation of taking the text away from images. And she invited me to New York to meet some of the other people that she was working with, including Richard Prince, and Barbara Kruger and Louise Lawler and a number of others. I found it was in London I felt very isolated and alone in what I was doing, and I suddenly felt, aha, there are others out there who have a similar interest. And yeah, it was a wonderful moment. I say a moment because very quickly the innocence, and I remember when I first arrived there, what really struck me was I had, of course, a massive collection of images, not anywhere near as massive as I have now, by the way, but by then it was quite a modest one. But I noticed that every person I went to meet, David Sally, Richard Prince, whatever, the first thing they brought out was their image collection. Everyone had that in common. And there was a wonderful innocence about that period in which we were just simply collecting images and fascinated by what the world was producing. And contemplating it in a way that somehow decontextualized it from those linear ways of reading or legibility, and engaging with the opacity of the image in a way. But very quickly a divide seemed to occur within the American group between, so if you might like say Louise Lawler and Barbara Kruger, Sherry Levine, who still maintained a very strong connection with text and with conceptual thinking, and those that I associated much more with, like Richard, who were trying to cut those ties with the text. And of course that led to two different camps emerging. But in America, of course, this became a sort of a battle. But none of this was happening in London. There was nothing like this.
Now, the American work is sometimes presented under the rubric of appropriation art, and I know you don't really like that term, and you prefer to use the term collage.
Yes, collage. The very fact that I use collage as a word in America, I suddenly realized that actually it was rather debilitating because it made me sound rather quaintly old-fashioned and European. But I did think it was a better alternative. And also I did want to make a relationship with the past. I think they were much more keen with the idea of breaking with the past, or at least if they made a connection with anything, it would be with the more recent history of American art, and pop in particular. Warhol, I remember being very big on their agenda. Whereas for me, surrealism was the real root of appropriation, as they called it. And I was very uncomfortable with this word, appropriation. It came up quite quickly as a sort of catch-all title. But I felt it was very deceptive. And in a way, it was completely the reverse of what I wanted to do. I didn't want to appropriate or master something that was out there and take it and make it my own. That wasn't the whole point of it. For me, the image was a site not of possession, but of dispossession, of the point at which I was, in a sense, resigning from a sense of mastery or of appropriation. So I've always felt appropriation is rather misleading because for me, the encounter with the found image is very much more to do with a sense of one's own absence. And I always feel that when I'm working on collages or whatever, whilst I've still got ideas about what I'm trying to do with the collages or with the images, I'm really only in the foothills of what I'm doing. The moment that the work starts to get going is the moment that I somehow leave the scene, that it's just what's there, nothing that I'm trying to impose on it. So you might say, my response to the found image is almost the inverse of the dominant one within American art at that time. I think, though, that Richard is probably the exception, and I think that's why we became so close.
That image of yours, the voyeur, seems to be a kind of emblem of that absence from the image, because is it possible to put that up? Or?
The voyeur. I have some.
Oh, okay. You'll know it from the exhibition. It's a film still image of a woman looking at another figure who's been cut out, and it's just present as a dark shadow in the image. Looks like a male figure. So that absent figure is both in the image, like extremely close, I mean, so close as to be in the image, but at the same time absent from the image. And that seems to somehow describe, I think, your relationship with it, not being distanced from the image, but at the same time being absent from it.
Absolutely. You know, that's exactly when I produced that piece, those were precisely my thoughts. I thought, it's actually Faye Dunaway. And I thought, well, this is every man's kind of approach to Faye Dunaway in that dark space cut out. Everyone has that relationship with Faye Dunaway, that intimacy. Yeah, I don't know what more to say about it, really. But I think in the light of what I was just saying, too, you could see it as almost symbolic. Retrospectively, I can see it's symbolic of that idea of absence from the work myself. So the silhouette, I think, did become that. I haven't thought about it until this moment, but that is probably what it stands for in a way, if it stands for anything.
Collage also seems to suggest to me more of an emphasis on materiality than appropriation. You know, and it's obviously very important that we're looking at the physical still, and that we sense, I think, the activity of cutting and maybe even the violence of the activity of cutting. And you kind of leave one image on another when you put a postcard, for example, on a still. You know, they're quite emphatically together but separate. And it's very different, for example, from, you know, to name a surrealist, Max Ernst's procedure in his collage, like 100 Headless Women, where he tries to make the join seamless. So I wondered, you know, how important to you the physical presence of the paper image is, particularly in this day of time of digital imaging.
I think that was another major difference in approach between myself and some of the other appropriators of that time. But you'd think it would be the other way around, really, wouldn't you? Because in a sense, if you're appropriating something, you think you'd be appropriating something physical. and so the physicality should be important. But in fact, most of the, in quotes, appropriation art does tend towards a kind of dematerialized sense of the image. Yeah, it's a paradox, I think. I had been reading Roland Barthes at the time, as most of us were in the late 70s, and The Pleasure of the Text talks about the seam, the edge, the cut, as being the site both of loss and of desire. And that was a really important idea for me. And so, in a way, it became the foreground of the work. I don't know, you could see the seam as being something that is physical, or you could equally see the seam as being something in which there is absence. So I don't know, I'm not totally sold on the idea that it's to do with making the image material, because I think it's also the point at which the image ceases to, it's a focus on the point both at which the image dies, if you like, at which it ceases to be an illusion, but also at that moment in which it's most present. So it is a double ambiguity. It is that essential ambiguity of the image that Blanchard talks about, I think.
So maybe we could continue to think about the seam and the relation between images, because, you know, most often in your work, the collage involves, you know, maybe two images, occasionally, very occasionally three, often one, two, but often it's two images. So it's a relation between an image and another image, or an image within the image. And it struck me very strongly when I saw an exhibition in Paris which had a title that included the term the image within the image, and it was looking at concealed images through the history of painting and printmaking. So from some very early examples from the 15th century and even earlier things, right up to Dali and so on. And I was very struck by a series of 4 seasons of Yossé, I guess you pronounce that, Yossé de Momper, in which the head becomes landscape and the landscape becomes head. And I was remembering when I saw those paintings, your masks, and the use of the postcard containing often an image of a cave or a kind of interior on the head. And I wondered, you know, in terms of that relation between images within the collage, how that might work in terms of a tradition of finding images within images.
I hadn't really thought about it. I don't know the artist you're talking about. Is he contemporary or?
No, early 17th century.
Oh, right. Oh, you must show
a series of 4 seasons from the early 17th century. But, you know, it's a bit of a genre, you know, of creating a landscape in which you see a figure or a head. In
like
his
Archimboldo.
Case, like Archimboldo too, as well.
Well, Archimboldo was important in that, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot. I don't know whether there's a question somewhere in there, but yeah.
Well, the question is whether what you're doing relates to that tradition in any way, and perhaps how is it through surrealism, or is it in some other way?
Yes, I think it probably is via surrealism. I'm less familiar with these kind of earlier precursors, but yes, the image within the image. I do. You said that I often use at least more than one image, but actually I've tried very hard to use 3. Well, sorry, here we go, I'm back. I've tried Michael was talking about the fact that I use 2, but sometimes more than one image in a piece, and I find it very difficult to use more than 2. I've been struggling with that recently, actually, and somehow it's something about the dialogue between 2 that is essential to me. 3 never seems to work for me. But the idea of the image within the image, could we put a mask up? Oh, we've got a mask up there, that's very good. Mask 1, this is my very, well, that's wrong. I hope that's not in the catalogue. That's the first one. Yeah, there are no more, but certainly no, that's the very first. It was actually a very difficult thing to do, this piece, because when I did it, it felt just like surrealism, and I thought, well, can one do this? In fact, the date is wrong as well. Actually, it's 1982, not 1992. I I don't know where we got all this info. I do hope it's not in the catalogue, but I'm sure it isn't. I often felt that the postcards, rather than being on top, seemed to evacuate a space behind in some ways. They seemed to root the image in a space beyond or through which you were looking. And that really interested me, the idea of, and I think it also engages the viewer in an act of complicity. The viewer is forced to try and find a face in this. And that is a way of engaging with a sort of subjective intensity in the image. And also the other thing is that I never sort of leave the vantage point of the viewer in my work, because I'm never producing any of the images, I'm just finding and putting them together. It means that I'm in the same position as everyone else. I'm also trying to find the image in its absence. Elias Canetti, the philosopher, said about masks that they show much, but they conceal much more. And I liked the idea of producing creating a sort of art which was actually an act of hiding, of concealment. In a way, I think that it's through of course, Canetti's view was that the mask was a way in which within ritual or tribal cultures, you demarcated ritual space from the profane space of ordinary tribal activities. So that by putting on a mask, suddenly you were in the presence no longer of another human being, but of a god, which is why he says that actually to tear off a mask mid-ritual in certain tribes was punishable by death. It was actually worse than murder because it was the murder of a god. And that sort of presence of fixity within in the place of the flow of facial expression was the presence of death within life. And this is, for Canetti, what ritual is, what myth is, what art is. And interestingly, masks are probably the very first visual art forms of Homo sapiens. We know from the cave complex of Lascaux, the earliest paintings known to man, that there is a picture of a man with a mask, so we know masks pre-exist painting. So I found that very interesting too.
I think I've realized the connection with the José de Momper Four Seasons now, from what you say, because if you think of a perspective image, perspective would place the viewer, in a sense, outside the image. I mean, the image would be a window, the viewer would be at a distance from the image, so the image would be something separate. Now, at the very same time that, perspective was becoming the dominant way of making paintings, artists were concealing these images within landscapes, which, as you say, draws you into a complicity with the image and in a sense destroys, arguably, the distance that perspective creates. So there would be a similarity, I think, with your relation to the image.
An intimacy. Yeah.
An intimacy, exactly.
But an intimacy with the other, not with the phenomenally present of the face, but of what is absent. In other words, that other space, the sacred, to use a very old-fashioned way of thinking about it. Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that you talk about, in that respect, perhaps also concealment and secrecy, because then that there's some hidden aspect to the image. What would the opposite of that be? The opposite would be transparency.
Transparency and legibility.
And legibility. Now, transparency and legibility would be, in a sense, part of the work of the daytime, the work of the rational, enlightened daytime.
Absolutely.
Concealment and secrecy would be something of the night. And I know that you like to work at night and have something of an insomniac relationship to images. So I wondered if you could say something about what the nocturnal relation to the image might be for you.
I don't think the nocturnal relationship necessarily... I don't think the nocturnal relationship with the image is confined to the night time, but more to the concept of night, I think. Night is a very important idea for me. It is, as Michael says, the time that I most often practice my work. For some reason, I've never been able to work during the daytime. I used to think it was because I taught during the day and mainly worked in the evenings and at night time. But since I've given up teaching, I'm still working predominantly at night, or at least most creatively at night, let's say. I do daytime things like, making contact with archives and those sort of daytime activities. But yes, I feel that art belongs to the night, actually. And actually collecting is a nocturnal activity. In a way, the daytime presence of the image as a part of communications and the world we live in is to do with momentum, the linearity of reading, the instrumental activities of the daytime, but cut off from their normal meaning and their normal function as meanings. They then become part of another space. You could call it the nocturnal, or you could call it the space of death, in fact. Death versus life activities. And to me, it's a moment at which an image achieves its stillness. I enjoy the nighttime as a time to work because of its stillness, because of the removal from the humdrum activities of the day. There seems to be a kind of elevation involved in the image. The image, as it collapses from signification, when it ceases to mean something in a direct way, when it ceases to have an instrumental function, it suddenly becomes something else. It takes on another aspect. Blanchot says it becomes visible, and I believe that's the case. I think our relationship with images in the culture we live in is that of, strangely, of invisibility. I think it's a great paradox that the 20th and 21st century have seen almost an obsessive accumulation of image production. But equally, there is a general condition, I would say, of cultural blindness to the world that accompanies this. Is that it's only by so my practice is a way to try and make visible what is in ordinary context invisible. It sounds like a paradox, but I think it's quite a. Oh, thank you very much.
John, can I jump in here with a question? Because you've touched on a couple of themes that I think really appear in the Dark Star series, and I'm wondering if you could sort of take us back to there's one of the Dark Stars on the screen, and talk. I mean, you were talking about the nocturnal nighttime. I mean, we've talked about the silhouette here being a kind of, darkness. You were talking also about, we haven't really yet talked about the third person, but I think there are a number of things, and I know these were a seminal series for you.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Well, in a way, I mean, the Dark Stars, I should just explain, were like the piece that Michael described earlier, in which the figure, the ostensive figure of representation has been removed. So the star that's there has gone, and you're left just with, if you like, the surround, sometimes just the aura, the physical, optical spotlight of the star. So hence the title Dark Star. But in a way, that by removing, in a way, the primary function of representation, I felt suddenly the image became image again, where it had ceased to be image and simply a conduit, of transparency to something else, a picture of your favorite film star or whatever it might be. You then become aware of it as something that is framed, and all the construction of the image and how images are constructed. So you're attending to it no longer as something, as a mediation, but as something in itself. And I guess and for me, that conversion of an image as something for something to an image in itself is a process of transition, if you like, from life to death, or from daytime to nighttime. It's that other presence. Blanchot talks about the way, analogizes it with actually the way a corpse, a dead person, the face of a dead person, suddenly seems to appear, normally in face-to-face contact in ordinary everyday life. We're so locked into instrumental communication that we don't really see a person's face at all. We react to their face, and their faces react to us, and we're locked into this interfacial communication. but we never really see the other person until we still that in some way, maybe take a portrait or something. So it's that kind of stilling, really, that I was interested in.
And also, I think in these, there's an emphasis on that disappearance or non-appearance is as much part of the image as its presence is, or its presence is somehow dependent on that non-appearance. And to turn to the third-person archive, there also seems to be there a kind of preoccupation with an edge between appearance and disappearance, as if these tiny figures that you're kind of rescuing from the margins of topological prints or illustrations or whatever, and making visible in a sense, are so small that they're on the point of disappearing, and you somehow saved them by putting them back at the center of these little pictures.
These aren't going to be on the screen too long. I actually don't like projecting these at all, because for me, the third-person archive, if you've been to see the show, you'll know they're very, very tiny. And scale, to me, is the form. And the projection of them like this is a sort of dissimulation of what they really are. That their scale is everything. And yes, I think Michael's description of them is very accurate. They're taken from topographical photographs from the 1920s and 30s, so they're quite old. And in a way, that means that these figures are distant not only spatially, but also temporally in historical terms. We're very removed from them. But what I found really interesting is by focusing on these tiny figures that not even the original photographer who took the pictures probably was even aware of, as they got smaller and smaller, I became interested in the way they seem to become more intimate, or they seem to command a kind of intimate connection between. I found them very compelling, and I felt a sense of the humanity of the figures somehow, in the barest contours of humanity, a sort of empathy that one wouldn't feel for a real person that you know a great deal about, or you can recognise. And it seemed the closer they got to that moment, that point of disappearance, in which there's just a trace, somehow the angle of the body betrayed something very intimate. And I found that rather interesting, because this double distance of time and space, creating this strange kind of intimacy. And I was very compelled by an idea by the philosopher Alfonso Lingus, who talked about death-bound subjectivity. I don't know whether we want to go into that particularly, because it's very dense. But he was very much interested in this idea of a subjectivity that is no longer accounted for in culture, that maybe was accounted for in certain sacred cultures, in which people gather together in the face of the unknown. And it's a kind of gathering of people from all classes and walks of life in this confrontation with the unknown. That the absence of this, in other words, the absence of religious experience in our culture, had destroyed what he calls death-bound subjectivity. And what he meant by that is a kind of connection with the other in just existence, not through shared interests. You can imagine, not politically. A political bond is to do with shared interests. All the bonds that we have as human beings between us in the world, in the contemporary world, are dominated by instrumental connections of one kind or another. They're political, in other words. They're to do with using another person. The bond that Alfonso Lingus believes is missing is that bond simply in the fact that we're all going to die. We're all confronting that same unknown. And that is the point of empathy. And I felt somehow the third-person archive figures touched on that sense of our connection in disconnection, you might say. The fact that we can never know another person's experience. The unknowability of another's life is just fundamental. And somehow these tiny figures made me feel that sense of a bond, not with a particular person, but with people in general, I guess.
And it's called archive, and archive is in one way or another, I think, quite important in relation to your work. So I'm kind of wondering what the connection is between, as it were, the archive of these tiny figures in relation to death-bound subjectivity and the other archives that you draw on in your work, the archive of film stills and film publicity stills that is in your studio filling a whole wall, for example.
Yes, I mean, actually, the reason I used the word archive for the third person was I knew this was going to be an endless series, so it would never be a series. Series has a particular meaning for me. I work in series, but I knew this was never going to come to an end, and so I left it open by using the word archive. I don't actually, now the word archive is very fashionable, and a lot of people talk about working from the archive, but I don't mean it in that kind of sense at all. It's more like an archive of lost souls in a way.
But I've wondered if it had a connection with film becoming a world of ghosts now, cinema.
Yes.
Exactly, yes. People, film stars are returning, as it were, from the grave onto the screen or into your work. And in the case of your work, they're often people who are completely forgotten and unknown now.
Yeah, I prefer the unknown, the faces of unknown actors. Yeah, I think there is definitely a resurrective impulse in my work. I want to bring things alive. I think that's very fundamental to art. I mean, the most ancient concept of art that comes from the myth of Orpheus is about bringing back the dead, making alive again, bringing Eurydice, the muse, the inspiration from the underworld, from the night, if you like, into the daytime of experience. I do see that as a fundamental impulse in art. Again, one that perhaps we're not so aware of these days.
And is there a relationship between that and the pastness of the images that you use? They are all marked as past, in a sense. You don't use really contemporary images, which is perhaps another difference with appropriation as it continues to this day.
Yes, absolutely. I've never quite known, I can't use images that are current or even relatively recent, and I don't know why. I don't have an answer to many of these fundamental questions. I tried to find answers, but I don't really know why I'm drawn to old images. Some people have suggested that I'm drawn to images of my childhood, the 1950s, and I have used a lot of 1950s and 60s images. But somebody did a sort of statistical survey of some of my work and actually noted that there was an actual point in time that I seemed to be referring to predominantly, and that was just about before I was born, the 40s. I was born in 1949, at the end of the 40s, and I do have this incredible pull towards images of that world before I was born, and there are all kinds of ways that one could think about that. I heard one professor in England describe me as in my marriage pieces, which are based on predominantly 1940s portraits of film stars, that I was trying to marry my mother and father, occupying that kind of pre-Oedipal space. And I find that quite a convincing argument, actually. Are we going to see one? Yeah, that's a good one. One of my favourites, that one. I don't know, I'm not sure. Many of the ideas about the sublime suggest that there is an attraction to wildernesses and worlds without people, or to the world before you were born, somehow the world in your absence. So I think there may be a connection with the sublime in some ways.
Talking about the world in your absence, it strikes me that there are several groups of works, and I'm thinking of Bridge, Underworld, and Lost Tracks, that create very strange spaces. And I wondered if you could say something about what you're doing in those works, often eradicating any horizon or outside, and yet there's in this one in particular, for example, there's extreme recession too.
Yeah, I don't know quite what the impulse was to do this, but these are double ground pieces. In other words, I've taken the grounds of two images, and in a way I was interested in the spacelessness of them. That when you remove the space above the horizon, you create a kind of purgatorial space, a space that has no space. And the tracks obviously represent temporality, time, movement. And so it was a kind of image of a spaceless world, perhaps the world we live in, the world of communications, in which everything is to do with temporality. There is no reflection, no stillness. I don't know though. Did you have a particular idea? I mean, I'm not quite getting where you're coming up, what you're asking here.
Well, I guess there seems to be both this movement of, into a sort of infinite vanishing point, and yet a kind of impossibility of getting out of the space, and a tension between those two.
Yeah, entrapment. Yeah. I mean, I did the reverse, which was the double sky pieces, which are the bridge pieces. Maybe we can have a look at the opposite. Yeah. So, as you see, the lost tracks were combinations of two grounds, if you like. And that was the dominant interest in the 80s. I did a lot of work with that early on. But later on, in the late 80s, early 90s, I started to become interested in the reverse, the double skies, which had a different effect entirely. Whereas the earlier work was more to do with a sort of spatial claustrophobia, or an absence of space. Almost a feeling of being buried, I felt. Whereas these were another kind of space. They represented a sort of dream space for me. The bridge pieces, where you get the almost agoraphobic feeling of being exposed in this thin realm of space that bridges these two spaces of infinity.
And does that say something about the image as a peculiar kind of space?
Yes, I think, I mean, this, as a bridge between worlds, yeah, absolutely. I see the image as exactly that, a bridge between worlds. But it's the sort of use of the image that's been annihilated through the connection with conceptual knowledge and through the word, in a way, and through narrative, and the way that the images are used sequentially. And of course, cinema is preeminently, for me, the space of image annihilation. We can never ever engage with the image in cinema. It's always moving away, transforming, becoming something else. There is no stillness. And in the lack of stillness, there can never be a relationship of fascination with the image. One tied into it perpetually. So the image is in connecting us in this instrumental way with the image. We can never see the image as a connection between this world and the other. The other is suppressed, so we only have this world, constantly. So the transcendental function, if you like, of the image has been lost. Cinema represents the ultimate cultural blindness to the image. In fact, technically, if you think about it, you cannot see an image at 1/24th of a second. It's impossible, perceptually. And isn't it a strange thing that we've created a culture in which we cannot see the images? And so it is a sort of blindness. We're always deferred from vision. Vision is always going to happen soon, but we never ever arrive at it. So my strategy is quite simple. Halt it. Let's have a look. See what it is that we're being subjected to.
I think there's a whole bunch of questions that come to me, and of course we have this film series coming up, and the film series is films that you had specifically mentioned as having an interest to you and your work, but I don't, and blindness is an important theme in the work, but I don't want to go there. Actually, I think we should open it up. We should leave it here and open up to questions from the audience, because I'm sure we have some. So. Yeah.
I have 3 novice questions. I'm asking them all at once because I don't think I'll get called on again. The first one is, how do you deal with copyright infringement issues when you appropriate images or use images, find images that somebody has a financial interest in? And another is, what's the difference between collage and montage? And the third is, what is the process, or what are the process and tools of your craft? Your art is, well, that's like, you've been talking about that, and that's amazing. But how do you do it? Do you put it on top of each other? Do you cut it up and butt it next to you? Do you use a paper cutter? What do you do?
Okay, 3 questions. How long have you got? Firstly, copyright issues, I ignore that entirely. I haven't been sued yet. I shall confront that when it comes to it, so let's leave that aside. I accept that my art is an act of theft, and that, there was an article in the British Journal of Photography which said John Stezaker, thief and vandal. I'm quite prepared to accept those titles. In fact, I don't like appropriation. I prefer the idea of theft. It's being more honest. Secondly, what was your second question?
It was montage.
Montage. Now that is a big issue. I could spend the whole lecture on that. To me, montage is the principle by which images are combined in this instrumental way, a la Eisenstein. I'm more of a Vertov person. I like the themes, the breaks, and that's collage. I think that's the simplest way of describing it. Montage is the world we live in. It's the world of communications. Collage is an interruption of that world. Third question, how do I work? I don't know myself. It's strange. I still don't know. I have no procedures. I don't even know where I work. My wife says I always start on the kitchen table, which is probably right, because that's when I bring my found images into the house with the shopping, so to speak, and that's where it all starts. I don't have any procedures, really. Apart from the obvious ones. I do cut images, and I put them over one another, and I try them out, yeah.
Can I add, do you reject a lot?
Yes. If you take an average, talking about my practice, say I start working in the evening one day, about 9 o'clock or whatever. I generally start about that time in the evening. By 2 or 3 in the morning when I finished, I probably produced, on an average day, maybe 10 collages. If in the morning when I wake up I find one that's redeemable, I'm very lucky. And I guess probably 90% of the work that I do is rejected. It's not destroyed, it's dismantled. And actually I've always found the process of dismantling also very creative, because it throws up new possibilities. And I have boxes all over the place of bits. So you can imagine, the more bits you've got, the more possibilities you've got. So it's,
the tabula rasa is an example of that, isn't it? That something that was left behind from cutting out.
Yeah. Yeah, we could look at that, actually. This is a very interesting example of that. This came about, I had been collecting the third-person archive images, the tiny little figures, and I was pursuing one particular interest at the time, which was figure with lamppost. And I had a collection of figures with lampposts. And I cut the image out rather awkwardly, and instead of it being at right angles, I cut it askew slightly. And when I saw the end result, with the absence of the image, it suddenly, the tabula rasa series was born. I think that's pretty self-explanatory.
You have been presenting your work in an alternative fashion, not the way you would like for your work to be seen, but it has been recreated for our benefit so that we might look at these altered versions of your work artificially and yet hear you talk about them. Why I bring that up is that I thought you made a dangerous statement when you said that film cannot do something, motion picture film. And of course, anybody who would be interested in motion picture film would challenge that statement, because as soon as you say that film cannot do something, it will do something. And I'm thinking of the alternate way to look at film. I don't know if you've seen a 35mm film, but you can look at each one of those frames and you can appreciate them for the still image that it is. So I don't really understand your problems with cinema.
I don't have a problem with it. I'm fascinated by cinema, but cinema is, as I say, a deferral of vision. You cannot see at 1/24th of a second any of those frames. Yeah, you can pull them out, but that's not the usual way of seeing film.
Well, it's not the usual way of seeing this either, yet we can appreciate it.
Yeah. I should also mention that the film stills that I use are not frames from the film, that they're actually independently created stills that go alongside the film. So the connection with film is not as direct as one might imagine. But I'm still not quite getting the point that you're making here. I mean, I'm claiming that cinema represents a kind of blindness to the image, and you're challenging that, I take it. So can you carry on with your challenge?
Well, I think that film might be aware of that, and that they are participants in the world of film art are aware of that. And so they attempt to do exactly what you say they cannot do, like the movement towards slow cinema, or even really no cinema, but an image that stays transfixed for a long time. Andy Warhol himself tried to do that.
Well, yeah, I mean, no, obviously I can't, that is quite different. I'm not saying all cinema, I'm saying 30, yeah, I see your point, sorry, yeah, no. Structuralist film, a whole lot of areas of cinematic experience obviously do challenge that, and that's very interesting. It's kind of, yeah. I think that's what some of the most challenging work that's been produced is in doing exactly what you're talking about. I choose to not do that. I choose to work with the still images themselves. But yeah, no, I'm very appreciative of Warhol's films in particular. Yeah.
We're just running short on time, and I know we have some.
I think possibly the most challenging moment for me in the show next door was your series of Sublime, the train smokestacks spewing towards smoke. And you talked a little bit about the notion of the sublime, but I wondered if you were also thinking about the idea of sublimation of solid matter turning into gas.
No, it's very strange you mentioned that, because I came up with the title Sublimes before I'd even thought of that connection. I don't know whether I was unconscious, but somebody from the tape pointed that out to me. They said, are you aware that sublimation is also relates, the roots of the concept of sublimation comes from condensation. Which is wonderful. I haven't thought of it, but it was perfect. In fact, the actual reason that I called them the sublime was not that at all. It was because when I was a child, the most sublime experience I think I ever had was steam trains coming. I used to wait for the trains to come through on my way to school. I'd wait for the 9 o'clock train to come through, and that it's a spectacle that we no longer have. But a train coming through a tunnel, and that sudden burst of smoke as it just comes out of the tunnel, is just one of the most immense sensations, or at least it was for me at that time. And I thought of it as the total image of the sublime, yeah. In fact, actually, in those days, school kids would gather around certain points like bridges in the 1950s and 60s, and the train drivers knew we were there, and they'd whistle and give us a good big puff of smoke just for our benefit, and then wave to us. And fantastic.
Should we have maybe one more?
I was wondering, one thing that you only briefly touched on is the concept of narrative. I feel like...
Sorry, the concept of what?
Of narrative built inside.
Yeah.
It seems to me you take a lot of delight in dismantling the form of narrative implicit in the original images, but you are you're very busily creating a narrative relationship. It's almost inevitable in putting two images next to each other. But I was wondering if you work for narrative or against narrative when you're constructing your pieces.
I think of it as working against the existing narrative, because I've got to dismantle that to regain the image quality. But for me, narrative isn't absent. It's not that I'm going to impose a new story on it, but I'm sort of looking for a coherence of my collage series. And I don't know whether it's exactly a narrative. You couldn't say there's a story there. But could we have the trial? Have we got all three? Yeah. But we've only got one of them. Doesn't matter. Oh yeah, here we are. But just occasionally I find groups from the same film, and that's my favourite thing, is to work with a series which has an existing narrative and to play with that in a different way. But for example, in the trial, by imposing these postcards onto what was an ordinary courtroom drama, I felt that somehow one started to touch on something more archetypal in terms of narrative. You might say an archetypal narrative, I guess. Something that belongs to all courtroom narratives. So it's not that you're interested in that particular story, but what's happening in all those kinds of stories. And of course the trial is a sort of reference to Kafka as well, my favourite writer. And he has a very problematic relationship with narrative, of course.
Well, I mean, should we keep going? There was a young woman, and then maybe the one woman in the back. So 2 more? Yeah?
I was wondering about the way you collect images for your own archive. Do you ever knowingly discard something that you're not going to use, as if, in the Tabula Rasa series or something that you've cut out? Do you ever discard a small scrap and resign yourself to the fact that you're never going to keep the entirety of an image that you found?
I'd like to do it a lot more than I do. I think one of my problems is the inability to throw anything away. There's always a redeemable quality lurking somewhere, but of course we have to be pragmatic about things. The only time that I can remember recently actually destroying things was I gave myself a challenge recently. I came across a book which somebody had given me actually, a current book of photographs of contemporary individuals. I can't remember what even the context was. And I started to challenge myself. Can I use an absolutely contemporary image with the current haircuts and all that sort of thing? And within the first few seconds of playing with this, I felt so disgusted with myself and what I was doing that I actually burnt the book. But that's very, very rare. I missed the last bit, sorry. In answer to the first bit of the question, definitely it is about the ambiguity, yeah, but what did you say at the end?
Combining pictures, is that using more than one image, is that a way to increase the ambiguity?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I see it as a kind of poetry in a way. Poetry is a combination of pre-existing things, words, and I like to think that I'm creating a sort of poetic ambiguity out of things that are normally read as totally unambiguous. Yeah. Matthew.
I have a question about, you were talking about how an image within an image as collage draws attention to the cuts and breaks and kind of draws attention to the materiality and disproves the existence of like a seamless image. And I was wondering how that thought can apply to you showing your work in a gallery space, and how if you see the gallery as a non-seamless environment to show your work, because I personally would see it as the way film functions, where it's sort of a seamless, you don't really pay attention to the environment as much when it's in this kind of vacuum of a venue.
Yeah. I'm not talking absolutes here. I'm not saying I'm removing things from their... You can't remove things from their meaning. You can attempt to, and you're quite right. The gallery context is another context which is dominated by legibility, instrumentality, and all the things I'm trying to get away from. You're quite perfectly correct, yeah. But we live in the real world. We have to try and struggle with that. I'm talking about aspirations probably more than realizations, but I do try whenever I can to create a situation which will disrupt that ordinary connection with the image in the gallery. And when I think things work well for me, that's what I do. I like to feel I create an estrangement even from that context too. I'm not trying to say I'm uncomfortable with the context of mass communications and very comfortable with the context of aesthetic communications, if you like.
I know Matthew has a question, but I'll just to share this little anecdote about the exhibition. When John and I were talking about it, John did say, of course, that he would prefer no labels, no wall text, no explanatory things by the curators, but of course we...
Yeah, and I'm the same myself, you know. If I see a work that really touches me in a museum, the first thing I do is go to the label and find out who did it. I mean, it's obvious. So, yeah.
But shall we? Yeah, Matthew.
I have a question. You started exhibiting seriously at a very young age, 20 to 21 years old. You were exhibiting in museums and institutions at the beginning of the 1970s. 40-odd years later, I'm just curious because at various times your work hasn't been visible. I've been curious why your work hasn't been shown. Without it being, a wholly reflective question, the sort of space of making work now at this age and the relationship with exhibiting the work from an early age. I was curious if you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I was very precocious and ambitious when I was young, and I jumped on the nearest bandwagon, really, when it came to conceptual art. I regret a lot of the work I did at that time. And it took me a while, really, to find myself as an artist. Probably a late developer, really. But I think I was happiest, really, strangely, without an audience, in those periods when you're describing, when I wasn't visible, because I could live with my illusions, in a way, without being disillusioned by the critical reception or whatever else was going on. And, of course, I'm delighted with the success I've had in recent years, and because it's allowed me to work full-time on my work. But yes, there is a strange... but one has to think, really, it has changed my relationship with the work, and I have to accept what this young lady was saying too, that I am communicating now. To me, before, my work was a sort of withdrawal from the world of communications, and now I'm putting it back. It's a strange phenomenon. I had a weird experience happen to me during the Whitechapel show, which is the same show in London when it started, in which I was walking along with my son back from the skate park to our house, and floating through the air, I saw an amazing image. And I often do this when I'm looking for images. I see an image and I chase after it wherever I find it. But it was literally a series of newspaper pages of images were floating through the air. And I ran over and put my foot on it, and it was one of my own images. Which was a strange point of circular...
Do we keep going? Shall we end? Shall we? Well, maybe we could have. We should end here, and if you're welcome to come up and ask John, questions in person.